Okay, so let's look at a slightly more difficult problem. Let's look at number 18 on your worksheet that you have in class. So number 18 is a little bit more difficult because our leading coefficient, that is the coefficient with the squared term, is not going to be 1 in this case. So number 18 is 2n squared plus 12n plus 10 is equal to 0. So we know right now that this is in standard form. So let's go ahead and identify our A, our B, and our C. So remember, our A is in front of the x squared, or the squared variable. Our B is the coefficient of the x variable. And our C is the constant. So what do you think? What is A, B, and C in this problem? So hopefully you were able to say, okay, the A is the coefficient of the squared variable term. So here's my squared variable, and the coefficient of that is 2. So I get 2. Here, let's do it like this. Let's say that A is equal to 2. B is equal to the coefficient of the variable that is not squared. I find my variable that is not squared, and the coefficient of that is positive 12. So B is 12. And now I find my C. It's just going to be the constant in my expression, which in this case is positive 10. So C is positive 10. Now what do you think? What do you think the next step is if we want to solve this quadratic by completing the square? So hopefully if you're looking at the step-by-step procedure, you know that the next step is to put the variable terms on the left-hand side of the equation and the constant terms on the right-hand side. So here, 2n squared, that's a variable term because it has a variable. 12n, that's a variable term because it has a variable. So these two need to stay on the left-hand side. But this 10 is causing a problem. This 10, we said the constants we want to be on the right-hand side of the equation. So I need to move this 10 over here by subtracting 10 from both sides. And what I get after I do that is 2n squared plus 12n. Now we know positive 10 minus 10, that's 0, so I can just leave that, ignore it, is equal to 0 minus 10, so that's going to give me negative 10 on the right-hand side of my equation. So now we have all of our variable terms on the left-hand side of the equation and my constant on the right-hand side. So now we can go on to step number 2, which is divide all terms by A. Now the reason we're dividing all terms by A is so we can get a 1 in front of the squared variable. So right now it's a 2. So we can't complete the square until that leading number here is a 1. And the way that we do that is by dividing each term. That is dividing this, dividing that, and dividing this by 2. So the way we do that is by dividing by 2, dividing by 2, and dividing by 2. Now we have 2 over 2, that's just 1, and I'm left with n squared plus, we have 12 over 2, which is 6, and don't forget to carry down your n. A lot of you forget to carry down your variables, but that n is still there. Negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5. Now this expression is in the form that we need it in to be able to complete the square. Now take a minute. What do you think we're going to add to both sides of this expression to complete the square? So you got to be a little careful on this one because the number in front of n is no longer 12. So in the last problem, we were able to just divide b by 2 and then square it to figure out what we need to add to both sides. But after we divided by 2 all the way through, this number has changed. So we're not going to divide b anymore because we started off with a number in front of our squared variable our squared variable. So this time, we're not going to divide b by 2. We're going to divide the number which is in front of the variable that is not squared by 2, and then square it. Now what does that mean? So here's my 6. My 6 is the coefficient of n, so I need to half this and square it to figure out what I need to add to both sides to complete the square. So what does that look like? I take 6, I half it, okay, I half it by dividing by 2 or multiplying by 1/2, and then I square it. Now what does that give me? That gives me 6 divided by 2, that's 3, and then I square it. 3 squared is 9. So that number 9, that's what I need to add to both sides to complete the square. So let's work that out. N squared plus 6n plus 9 is equal to -5 plus 9. Now I have completed the square. That is the step that we call completing the square. Now we need to factor the left-hand side. Okay, this is step number 5. We need to factor the left-hand side. And just to clarify, I didn't explicitly state this, but I want to just clarify, this step, adding the 9, is step number 4 that says add your result from step 3 to both sides of the equation in step 2. Adding that 9 to both sides of the equation is step 4. Now we're on step 5, factor the left-hand side. So you can factor this several different ways. You can either factor it using that trick that I showed you in the first Educanon video, or you can factor it using the step-by-step method that we covered on Monday. Now, just take a minute. I don't care what method you use, but factor this side, and rewrite your expression. Go. So hopefully after you factored this, you got something that looks like this. N plus 3 squared is equal to, okay, this is what you should have got after you factored it. And this is equal to that expression. So if this expression is equal to 9 minus 5, then that means this has to be equal to 9 minus 5. 9 minus 5, that's going to be 4. And just to remind you, I want you all to be able to just go straight from this step to this step. It's really easy. Remember that after you complete the square, every single expression, when factored, is going to have this form equal to some constant. But how did I know that it was positive 3 in here? I knew it was positive 3 here by just halving the coefficient of n. So I find the coefficient of n, it's positive 6. Half that, I get positive 3. So it's perfectly fine to go straight from this step to that step. It'll work every single time. Just half the coefficient of your variable that is not squared, so in this case it's just n here, okay, the coefficient of that, half of 6 is positive 3. So I just plug that in here and I'm ready to solve. Let's go through this kind of quickly. I take the square root of both sides. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other side. Remember, when we take the square root of a square, that square just goes away, and I'm left with n plus 3. Now remember from the last video, when I'm taking the square root of a number, I'm asking myself, what number can be multiplied by itself to get the number inside the square root sign? And in this case, there are two answers, because we know positive 2 times positive 2 is equal to positive 4, and I also know that negative 2 times negative 2 is equal to positive 4. So, really, the answer to this is plus or minus, so we can have a positive or a negative 2 as the solution to the right-hand side, that is the square root of 4. So we have our two solutions. Now let's solve for n, and the way we solve for n is by subtracting 3 from both sides. Subtract 3, and I get n is equal to negative 3 plus or minus 2. So here are our two solutions. Now let's work it out. So n is equal to negative 3 plus or minus 2. Let's go to the next slide. N is equal to negative 3 plus or minus, so let's start with our plus 2, or it could be n is equal to negative 3. Now, remember, we want to keep this the same. We're not saying that this is plus or minus. This has to be a negative number. This is negative 3. So negative 3, we keep the negative 3 here. But now we're going to subtract 2. And we get n is equal to negative 3 plus 2, which is negative 1. And over here on the other side, we get negative 3 minus 2, which is n is equal to negative 5. So those are our two solutions. All right, guys, go ahead and finish the rest of the homework assignment. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask. Thanks, guys.